Thank you, Jacopo. And thank you, Professor Hugh Houghton and the organizers for accepting my paper. It's a privilege to be here. And as you can see over there, this meeting is being recorded.
Sorry. Just found it. Yeah.
What if you just press end? There we go.
There you go. All right. So as you can see over there, the title of my paper is the case of Lectionary 60, BNF Grec 375, transmitting truth alongside myth, which means it's not a Catena manuscript, and it was not cataloged by Jorge Parkolov, like many others, so as far as I know. But I must confess that my relationship with this manuscript was purely selfish on my part since the very beginning that I encountered it. I was totally focused on the text of this manuscript for my own dissertation, and utterly uninterested in this document as an artifact. But the more that I interacted with this manuscript, the more it sort of invited me to explore its attributes that are very interesting as an artifact. Some have said that the manuscript is interesting, while others said that it's strange. I find it fascinating. And keeping in line with the theme of marginalia, I want to invite you to observe with me L60 to see how the marginal notes and added content have changed the character of this manuscript as an artifact. L60 is more than a witness to the New Testament text. It has become indeed a testimony to the deliberate and ongoing efforts to uphold and circulate a hagiographical narrative of a composite saint. So we'll start with a brief description of L60. Then I'll draw your attention to the marginalia and extra material added to the manuscript that most likely link the lectionary to the Abbey of Saint Denis in modern day France. And finally, I'll show you why L60 became a witness to and a recipient of a hagiographical myth, and to some extent, even a carrier of such myth. And in the end, I'll try and draw some practical implications of my observations. So let's move on to the general characteristics of the document. L60 is an 11th century Greek lectionary of the Epistles, Acts, and the Gospels. So it's an apostolic evangelion. The overall craftsmanship employed in the production of L60 is somewhat unimposing. The parchment used for the lectionary is irregular and defective at several points. The text is written in black ink only, including the liturgical sections that are commonly written in red ink. On many pages, the lines are slanted and the handwriting is far from polished. The ornamentation throughout L60 is unimposing, unimpressive as well, even at those places where you would expect some sort of more elaborate or pronounced art, like the beginning of the sanctorial cycle or the beginning of the Paschal cycle. So the asymmetrical and defective shape of the parchment, the monochromatic and irregular appearance of the text, and the simplistic ornamentation mean that L60 is aesthetically unattractive. Moreover, they imply that the original community in which or for which the document was produced and used either lacked certain material resources or assigned limited value to aesthetics. One of the most intriguing pieces of this document is the colophon. It offers details about the place, person, and time of production of L60. And as you can read over there, the Eclogadia was completed by the Presbyterian monk Elias Filiotis on November 26, a Sunday at the 9th hour in the year 1021, 5th ediction, in a Frankish village named Castro de Colonia. Now, the precise origin of this manuscript remains enigmatic, as Duplessis pointed out. The main reason is that the phrase "El Jora Franquías Castro de Colonias" seems to be a later addition to the colophon. The phrase is written in a conspicuously different handwriting compared to the rest of the colophon and the main text. The copyist who added this information wrote awkwardly over the punctuation mark that follows indictiones epsilon. The color of the ink matches that of the main colophon as a whole, which perhaps indicates that the geographical information was added most likely around the same time as the rest of the colophon. The handwriting and style of the ectheses resemble those of other documents linked to Campania and Calabria in southern Italy. So it's plausible that L60 was copied by an Italo-Greco scribe in Cologne, as De Vries and Crivello proposed. Besides the controversial place of production of L60, the colophon mentions the copyist by name, Elio Presbitero que Monarco Spilioto. According to the Acta Sanctorum, Elias Spiliotes was a hermit born in Reggio Calabria between 860 and 870, who practiced rigorous asceticism in southern Italy. Eventually, Spiliotes became an influential monk and priest and helped found the monastery, the rock monastery of Milicuca in Calabria, where he also served as abbot. So Elias overlapped a little bit with Milos, who helped found the monastery in Grottoferrato. And curiously, the feast of Elias Spiliotes is mentioned in the lectionary, marginal note in a lectionary from Grottoferrato. However, according to the Acta Sanctorum, Elias Spiliotes died and was buried in the monastery of Milicuca in 960. Or around 60 years before the composition of L60 in 1021. So Elias Spiliotes probably wasn't the copyist of L60. Also, the anonymous copyist of the document replicated the information of the colophon. That's, I think, most likely what happened. And Kershaw Blake suggested that a while ago. Interestingly, the copyist added a note after the colophon on folio 193R that provides crucial information about the relationship between the copyist of L60 and the details of the colophon. And the note reads, "For just as that which was written after the selection, thus I also wrote." The handwriting of the note matches that of the main part of the colophon and the main text. It appears the copyist indicated that the colophon was in the exemplar. In this case, L60 was probably written in a place that to some degree or another was under the influence of Elias Spiliotes and is likely indirect evidence to the scribal activities of the Calabrian saint. Irrespective of the precise place of production and the individual who copied the manuscript, the document was most certainly produced in the West for a community that observed the Greek liturgy and in a context influenced by asceticism. Let's move on now to the marginalia and additional material. At some point, L60 became the property of owners who avidly annotated the manuscript in the margins and added fresh content. Since these marginalia are written in Latin or in Greek, but in Latin letters, they constitute signs that unequivocally indicate that L60 was used in Western contexts, whether in public or private settings. And I thank Anna Persic for helping me with some of the Latin transcriptions to make sure that I would get them right. So let's start with common notes. Although a few notes are unrelated to biblical content, most appear at the beginning of lections as Latin translations to contextualize the content for the reader. Because the color of the ink and the handwriting of these marginalia vary, it seems that there are multiple layers of notes that were added at different times and by different users. For example, there is a set of notes written in Latin in a dark shade of black ink and occurs consistently from folio 3V to 14R. Then that set of marginal notes drops away. Twice selection identifiers are neatly written in the margin in Greek, but using Latin letters. These identifiers seem to be the work of professional copyists, since the handwriting resembles that seen in Latin liturgical manuscripts that contain Greek text written in the Latin letters. Additionally, several marginal notes indicate that certain readers were unfamiliar with Greek and used L60 to learn the language. Now, moving on to the significant notes that I want to focus more and additional material. Besides the numerous notes that translate content from Greek to Latin, L60 preserves a set of peculiar marginalia and additional content. The material connects the manuscript to the specific community that adapted the lectionary to reflect its own liturgical practices. More specifically, the extra content of L60 places the document in a setting that deeply revered Saint Dionysius. Since the document was produced in the West and for Western users, the saint most likely in view is Saint Denis, Saint Denis, the Latin version of Saint Dionysius. And the specific community traditionally associated with this lectionary is the Abbey of Saint Denis in France. It is striking that the lection from Acts 17, 22 to 34, the account that narrates the conversion of Dionysius under Paul's sermon in Athens, occurs several times across the lectionary as a later addition. It appears on folio 56, 153 recto, and 194 verso. On folio 56, the lection was added in a space intentionally left blank by the original copyist. On folio 153 recto, the lection appears with a Latin translation in the upper margin that reads, Stans Paulus in medio areopagi ait. And on folio 194 verso, the lection is appended at the end of the manuscript with the title Epistles and Festo Beati Dionisi. Although titles and marginal notes are written in Latin, the lection itself is copied in Greek. This suggests that those who added the lection strive to keep some degree of consistency in the language of the biblical content. The same lection is highlighted elsewhere in a different way. On folio 41 recto, a marginal note appears in the Paschal cycle besides the lection for Tuesday of week 6 after Pascha. The note reads, Stans Paulus in medio areopagi ait. The note is not a translation of the beginning of the lection besides which it occurs. Instead, it is preceded by that little cross symbol over there, which also appears in the middle of the text to mark the beginning of a separate reading. The reading in question is that of Acts 17, 22 to 34. In the sanctoral cycle, the entry for October 3rd, the feast of Dionysius the Areopagite, refers the reader back to this day over here in the manuscript to the lection of Acts 17, 19 to 34. So in the original layer of L60, the lection for Dionysius the Areopagite is Acts 17, 19 to 34, while the multiple layers added later assign Acts 17, 22 to 34 to the saint. Relatedly, a description in the top margin of folio 154 recto reads, Dionysius Areopagita. It identifies gospel readings listed in the sanctoral cycle for Dionysius the Areopagite on October 3rd. Considering the rather repeated emphasis on Dionysius the Areopagite seen in the marginalia and added lections, it appears that L60 came to the possession of a community that highly esteemed the saint. Indeed, a marginal note on folio 154 recto even pronounces a curse on anyone who steals L60, the book of Dionysius the Areopagite. Liber Beati Dionisi Areopagite, qui eum furatus fuerit, anathema sit. Besides the marginalia and added content, added lections, the community also added material at the beginning of the document. Functioning sort of like a cover, this material is one of the most notable features of the manuscript. According to Ioannis Patharakis, the image of Christ in glory possibly dates to the 13th century. The most intriguing feature on the cover is perhaps the inscription on the left side, which highlights once again the reverence of the community towards St. Dionysius. Written in runic scripts, the inscription is laid out vertically in 2 lines on the left side of the folio. These runic characters fit the profile both Gunkhauser described as belonging to a medieval development of the 16th character Germanic futarch known as dotted runes. The system advanced in this fashion around the 10th, 11th century, possibly in Denmark, and then it spread to the rest of Scandinavia. In this stage, the runic symbols have correspondence with the Latin alphabet. To the dismay of anyone fascinated by runic scripts, the two lines conveyed no message to genuine users of the original Germanic futhark or its later forms that developed in Scandinavia. Line 1 is merely the alphabet written in the same order as the Latin based on approximate phonetic correspondence between the two languages. Line 2 is the transliteration of the Latin title in the runic script, and the transliteration is above line 2, Sanctus Dionysius. Since it was useful only insofar as it corresponded to Latin phonemes to form meaningful words in Latin, the inscription was written for the benefit of Latin readers. It was most likely made for decorative purposes. Most importantly, the decorative runic inscription seems to have had the pragmatic effect of drawing the user's attention to Saint Dionysius. On the back cover, 195 recto, we find another note that connects the manuscript to Saint Denis in France, and perhaps to a 13th century abbot, Odo IV. That was the suggestion of de Vries. So because of the notable and repeated importance ascribed to Saint Dionysius throughout this document, some scholars concluded that the Abbey of Saint Denis in modern-day France was the original recipient of L60. This is what Scholz and Scribner believed. It is unclear, however, that such was the case. As described above, the overall craftsmanship of L60 seems somewhat inadequate for an abbey as prestigious as that of Saint Denis. Because Saint Dionysius was the patron saint of Paris, the abbey became the center of royal and political activity besides the customary religious life. Unsurprisingly, liturgical material fashioned for Saint Denis tended to be more elaborate than L60. One example is the Gospels of Saint Denis. Produced in the 10th century, this tetraevangelion is rather simple in its ornamentation compared to other manuscripts produced for Saint Denis. And the parchment is defective in very few places. Nonetheless, the scribe used red and green ink, as you can see there. The art in the ectheses and the symbols of the evangelists are more elaborate than those of L60. Another example is the extremely elegant Missal of Saint Denis, which was prepared for the abbey around the same time as L60. The Missal stands in stark contrast with L60. It is richly and sumptuously decorated with gold, colorful full-page paintings, large and intricately ornamented incipits, and the cover is even adorned with jewels and ivory. In addition to the craftsmanship, the liturgical calendar of L60 seems to imply that the document was produced for a community that observed Eastern practices and celebrated the liturgy in Greek. If indeed L60 was crafted for Saint Denis, it is striking that the sanctorial cycle of L60 correctly lists the feast of Dionysius the Areopagite on October 3rd, but no separate feast for Dionysius on October 9th. The celebrations of Dionysius on October 9th would be expected of a liturgical document prepared for a Western liturgical community, especially if that community was the Abbey of Saint Denis. Both the Tetraevangelion and the Missal crafted for Saint Denis dedicated several folia of elaborate liturgy, long liturgy, for the celebration. Despite the uncertainty concerning the original intention of those who first crafted the manuscript, the numerous marginalia and extra material give us confidence about one of the owners of this lectionary. The Abbey of Saint Denis once held L60 in its precious collection of manuscripts, and some of its members ensured that the manuscript reflected their deep reverence towards the patron saint of their land. Let's look at the hagiographical background of L60 and Saint Denis. The recurring emphasis of L60 on Dionysius the Areopagite in the context of Saint Denis is properly understood only in light of the bewildering hagiographical tradition involving Saint Dionysius, both in the East and West. The first individual in viewing this hagiography is Dionysius the Areopagite, the New Testament figure who believed the message about Christ under Paul's sermon in Athens, as we read in Acts 17. According to the tradition, Dionysius the Areopagite was an influential Athenian citizen. After his conversion, he was appointed by Paul himself as the first bishop of Athens. Historically, however, the abbey of Saint Denis traces its roots back to a different Dionysius. According to Historia Francorum 130, written by the Merovingian ecclesiastical leader Gregory the Tour in the 6th century, Dionysius was among 7 missionaries who were sent to Paris to minister over there to evangelize Gaul in the 3rd century. Dionysius ministered in Paris, where he was martyred by sword during the persecution of Decius. As other lives of saints, however, elements in the Dionysian tradition that most likely relate historical events gradually evolved, culminating in embellished accounts of heroic and spiritual feats. Already in the 6th century, the tradition had developed and changed the chronology of the saint. According to a hymn composed by Venantius Fortunatus, friend of Gregory the Tour, Dionysius was sent from Rome by Pope Clement in the late 1st century. This expansion evidently shortened the chronological gap that once separated Dionysius, bishop of Paris, from Dionysius the Areopagite, bishop of Athens. It was around the same time, 5th, 6th century, probably in the context of Caesarea, that an anonymous Greek author composed 4 philosophical theological treatises and 10 letters under the pseudonym Dionysius the Areopagite, bishop of Athens. The Christian and Neoplatonic corpus, known as Corpus Dionysiacum Areopagiticum, was widely received in the East and West by influential theologians, scholiasts, abbots, and philosophers. Parallel to the dissemination of the Corpus Dionysiacum, the hagiography of Dionysius evolved in the West in 3 main steps, each step making specific contributions to this ever-growing account, and as recently outlined by Michael Lappage. The first stage in the 8th century provides details involving Dionysius and his 2 famous companions, Rusticus and Eleftherius, such as their mission, martyrdom, burial in the property of a noblewoman, and the construction of a basilica. The second phase was compiled in the first third of the 9th century. Among other embellishments, the stage contains 2 major innovations to the tradition. The 3rd century martyr Dionysius becomes the 1st century Athenian convert Dionysius the Areopagite, and Dionysius becomes a cephalophoric saint. So the saint now carries his own head for 2 miles to the burial site. No surprise to know that Dionysius became the patron saint of headaches. It is therefore in this stage that the 2 saints are conflated. It is while the 3rd stage unfolds that this conflated version of the hagiography of Dionysius is then further expanded and becomes more deeply embedded in the life of the Abbey of Saint Denis. This was mainly due to the influence of Hilduin, who served as abbot of Saint Denis and archchaplain, being heavily involved in the political affairs of Francia during the reign of Louis the Pious. During this time, when the Franks and Byzantines maintained close diplomatic ties, the Byzantine Emperor Michael II offered to Louis the Pious the Greek text of the Corpus Dionysiacum as a gift in 827, which was safeguarded in the Abbey of Saint Denis. Since Hilduin was an outstanding scholar who knew Greek, one of his pressing tasks was to translate for the first time the Dionysian corpus into Latin. Additionally, Louis the Pious commissioned Hilduin to produce a revised version of the Passio of St. Dionysius to express his gratitude to the saint. In his version of the hagiography, Hilduin inherited the main elements of the 2 previous Passiones and further expanded the tradition. One of the primary innovations of Hilduin was that he identified St. Dionysius as the author of the 5th, 6th century Corpus Dionysiacum. Additionally, he elaborated on the tortures inflicted on the saint and added the detail that Christ himself appeared to Dionysius in prison and administered the sacraments to him. As a result, Hildwin's saint, as Anna Taylor correctly observed, is an amalgamation of an Eastern saint, a Western saint, and a 5th century theologian. And it was this fabricated and embellished version of St. Dionysius' life that was firmly established in St. Denis and broadly circulated for centuries, thanks to a great extent to the instrumental work of Hildwin in the Abbey of St. Denis. Parisians were left with a composite legend as their patron saint. Conclusion, some practical considerations. What is the relevance of all this? First of all, for manuscript studies, I think we've got enough of this. B&F Grec 375 illustrates how instrumental marginalia and additional materials in those manuscripts can be in helping us locate a document in its socio-historical context. Now, more specifically for New Testament textual criticism, the various occurrences of the lection from Acts 17:22 to 34 provide us with the opportunity to explore the 4 textual layers of this passage transmitted in a single document. I transcribed and collated the lection to investigate the nature of the text in the 4 layers. And this is just a sample of 18 variation units in the layers of L60. Thankfully, we have ECN Acts, and L60 was used for the addition. So I was able to play around with this a little bit. So for the sake of time, I'll just move on with 3 final observations concerning this. First of all, the added layers are not mechanical repetitions of the original layer of L60 or of one another. The first layer of L60 breaks from the other 3 in 8 of the 18 units. Most often, the 3 added layers agree with one another 13 out of 18 times, but they do disagree amongst themselves 5 times of the 18. Of the 3 added layers, the last one, layer 4, breaks from the others 4 out of 5 times to agree with L60, the original layer. To some degree, then, the final layer brings the text closer back to the first layer, although it's not identical with it. On the other hand, layer 3 departs from the other 2 added layers only once. So it disagrees with layer 2 only one time. So layers 2 and 3 used almost identical exemplars. Second, often the text of the added layers moves away from the Byzantine tradition in agreement with the Ausgan's text. And third, considering the multiple layers of texts in L60 for that specific passage, Acts 17:22 to 34, it seems we have 4 different witnesses to this passage, 3 at least. As an artifact with so many features and a rich social historical background, we are dealing with B&F Grec 375, which I call the Dionysian Lectionary, the witness to and recipient carrier of a hagiographical myth. However, as a witness to the New Testament text, the single label L60 fails to encapsulate the textual complexities and beauty of this lectionary in Acts 17:22 to 34. Thank you.
We have only 1 minute, so if somebody has a quick observation, I think Dennis would be very happy to answer. Tommy?
Just one observation, but in Corinthians, in Acts 17, there is the only single name of the saint, Dionysius.
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
No, I haven't, but it makes sense.
Yeah. It's mid-second century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Especially the Latin.
Mm-hmm. So the tradition was evolving. Yeah, for sure.
It was also in opening second as well. The LSU.
Okay. 037 and 06.
Dennis, thank you very much for your presentation. Fortunately,